I've never made a true top 10 video before, but when I looked back through my 2025 reading, it turns out there are 10 books I want to mention. I'm feeling like a real-life booktuber over here. And I think this is the first year I have more nonfiction than fiction. It's a turning of the tide. If you're Jennifer, hang on. If you're new here, I'm Jennifer. If you're also a Jennifer, you were probably born in the 70s or 80s or early 90s. But if you're new here, I'm one of many Jennifers, and this video will give you a really solid overview of what I love to read. We've got a classic novel, some history, biography, memoirs, and plenty of Eastern Europe and World War I to go around. Yeah, looking through these titles is not a very sunny group, but it's not the sunniest world we've got ourselves here. The first to mention is Goethe's Elective Affinities. Great title, great book. I have the translation from German that was done by R.J. Hollingdale, and this is a novel that begins with a couple, Eduard and Charlotta, who are living their peaceful lives on their peaceful estate, as characters at the beginning of novels do, but then two additional people come to live with them. We have a man called the Captain and a woman named Ottilia. And one night, the captain talks about the scientific phenomenon of affinities, where certain chemicals are naturally drawn to each other. So Goethe is laying out the metaphor for you. He's telling you how the first half of the book is going to go. Certain natures in the household are going to be drawn to others. But from there, I don't know, things get strange because there's a hint of the supernatural, of the spiritual, of the mythic, and then a lot of interior drama. For those of you who aren't very familiar with Goethe, he's one of the great romantic writers, and for many, the greatest German language writer. And people are more likely to have read the bookends of his career, The Tsars of Young Werther and Faust. But Elective Affinities was published in 1809 when Goethe was around 60 years old. And you can feel his ambivalence toward marriage and divorce. For me, there's something both salacious and restrained about this novel because despite the dramatic setup, there's a kind of puttering quality to it. It feels like the characters are puttering around to fill their days, which is meant to be a commentary on aristocratic life in this era, and it's a biting commentary at times. Next was a book I read for my memoirs project earlier this year called The Autobiography of Margaret Oliphant. And I have to say, even though most of the books on this list are war-related in some way, I would be hard-pressed to say that any of them is more profound and more distressing than this one. So Margaret Oliphant was a prolific Victorian writer, and she was widowed at a young age and supported her extended family on her writing. And she outlived all three of her children. Her daughter died at the age of 10, and her sons died in their 30s. One of the remarkable things about this autobiography is she started it from a neutral vantage point to keep a record of her life, a mundane record of travels and work and whatnot. And she had the thought of maybe selling this piece of writing down the road at some point to continue helping her sons financially. Instead, in the process, she found herself recording loss after loss and overwhelming pain and confusion as to how she could be asked to bear this much by the God she still trusts in. As I was flipping through it again, I saw that on almost every page there are these lines like daggers. For those of you who are interested in the period, she also comments on her contemporaries like Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot with evident jealousy and a real uncertainty about her own merits as a writer, because she can't know what she might have been capable of in the context of an easier life, a life where she could have focused more on nurturing her talent instead of constantly producing. But would she have wanted to write in any other way? She goes back and forth like that. There were multiple aspects of this book that were fascinating, and it is a difficult one to read, but it's one I would read again. It's so moving. Okay, I read two glorious and gloriously massive books in the second half of this year. One was a history title called From Peoples into Nations, A History of Eastern Europe by John Connelly, and the other was Heather Clark's biography of Sylvia Plath called Red Comet. I think I'll start with Red Comet because this encapsulates so many of the best things about reading a big book. Cards on the table, I actually DNF'd this when it was published in 2020. I read about 100 pages at the time, and I struggled with the first 100 pages again because There are these moments that reminded me of a college paper of mine where one of my professors wrote in the margins, "Speculation is not analysis." And ever since then, when I've read nonfiction, I've thought to myself, is this analysis or is it speculation? And there were a few too many speculative moments in the first section for a writer of Clarke's caliber, in my opinion. However, pretty much as soon as we get to Plath's high school English class, we're in business. Like, it's so good. So consistently good. My impression is that Plath is now best known for her only novel, The Bell Jar, but she was primarily a major 20th century poet whose literary quality and influence are still appreciated, but are largely overshadowed by the circumstances of her death. When people think of her, they think of the fact that she stuck her head in an oven. And there is something inescapably sensational about the circumstances of this attractive, accomplished 30-year-old mother killing herself when she did and how she did. But to me, that makes it all the more significant that I came away from this book with so many vivid impressions of her that aren't about her death. And it's honestly been a long time since this many details of any book were this vivid to me months later. It's the story of someone who was both naturally gifted beyond belief and who also worked herself into the ground in the service of her art, her life's passion definitely, but also to serve the feeling that she needed to keep accomplishing things. I would say I'm not naturally drawn to biographies of writers. I mean, there's a lot of suppressed torment and self-doubt and toiling at a desk and drinking, typically. You know, the dynamic is competing with the static when we're talking about the life of an author. But Clarke does a really solid job of contextualizing Sylvia Plath. She contextualizes her as an American in a post-war UK, as a person who needed mental health treatment at a time when such treatment was often negligent, and as a writer in the 1950s at a time when, on the whole, women weren't respected as writers. Plath died before Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was published, and it was to her benefit and to her cost that she was married to another major 20th century poet, Ted Hughes. And Ted Hughes himself is such a striking figure that I think it's to Clarke's credit that I came away from this having absorbed a lot of nuanced information about Hughes without him overtaking the narrative. This is Plath's book, and like I said, it's such a great read. It's very detailed, but everything moves at a clip, especially the further you go. There's a lot of careful literary analysis throughout. And as a side note, Clarke wrote this while she herself was raising two young children, like Plath had been at the end of her life, at the height of her stress and anguish and creativity. I'll say too that because I was reading it for so long, Red Comet became a part of my life, to the point that one day I was listening to Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, the Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young song. It's hard to fathom why YouTube tells me I don't appeal to the under 30 demographic, you guys. But I was listening to that song in the car, and suddenly it hit me that this song was about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. And it's not, but it is to me now, because by that point, so many things in my life were making me think of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. Sometimes it hurts so badly, I must cry out loud. I am lonely. See, I guess I had a lot to get off my chest there, but less so here, because I've recently devoted a good amount of time to this other big book from People's Intonations by John Connelly. And thank you so much to those of you who gave my big books video a chance, because I know it's not my normal kind of video. But anyway, this is a history with nationalism as its main character. It's about the linguistic and then ethnic nationalisms of Eastern Europe as they wrote themselves into existence in the 19th century and then were drawn or redrawn as states on the world map following World War I. That's the general trajectory for a lot of these present-day countries. And I want to say to start that even though I think highly of Connelly's book and of the clarity of his writing, I would recommend getting a foothold in at least one topic or era before you dive into the deep end with this. Some of you prefer to start with a broad overview, even if that means you might be missing a fair amount. So if that's you, disregard this advice. But I do think that reading a book or two about the communist era in Eastern Europe, or the revolutions of 1848, or the post-World War I, post-World War II periods in the region will help you notice a lot more about Connelly's specific points of comparison and contrast. I was already familiar with most of these topics, and there was still a lot to filter and assimilate here. I focus on Eastern European studies. For those of you who are new here, that's the context for why I would cheerfully do this to myself in my free time. But in reading from people's intonations at this moment in time, I've been thinking about something I've said for years, which is that if you want not to understand, but to start thinking through some of the paradoxes of the state of Israel, the place to go is not Middle Eastern studies, it's not biblical studies, it's not even mainly Holocaust studies, in my opinion. You have to know the history of the nationalisms of Eastern Europe, because it's the cradle of a particular form of ethno-religious nationalism. And also, as you go through this book, the ongoing story is one of both rational and irrational and good and bad faith responses to certain inescapable tensions in the project of defining a nationality, because isn't one of the fundamental aspects of determining who is Polish or Czech or Romanian, the act of determining who is not those things, who is excluded from the nation. For a time, the theory was that these smaller states would represent peoples more fairly and more conscientiously than a mass bureaucratic collection of peoples like the Austrian Empire could. But if you look at the story of minority rights in the region, they didn't necessarily trend upwards once these smaller states became the de facto geopolitical actors. There's such an interesting and horrible irony to these dynamics, where the nations of Eastern Europe truly fought for their right to exist. And in doing so, they didn't then turn around and nurture the precarious existence of other peoples. Often it was the opposite. It was subjugate or be subjugated. I'm used to people assuming what I do is niche, and I know why that is. I'm speaking to you right now from a small potatoes niche YouTube channel, but I'm telling you that you don't have to have a special interest in this area for it to be unnervingly relevant to many contemporary conversations. And for that reason, and for plenty of others, I appreciate Connelly's astuteness and his thoroughness in presenting these complex and very layered histories. Speaking of the precarity of nations in this part of the world, the next book is about Russia's war in Ukraine. It's called War Diary by Yevgenia Belorusets. She's a Ukrainian writer and photographer, and it's her daily account in Kyiv of the first 41 days of Russia's full-scale invasion before she then sought safety in Berlin. For me, it's hard to describe the impact of this book because it's a humble project, but it's so effective for that. Effective because there's enough to deal with on a humble scale. In her peacetime and now wartime roles as both writer and photographer, she's used to observing other people very carefully, and she has this innate artistic sense of the shadow and light in everything. So that creates this balance between her inner reflections and the descriptions of all the lives that are still going on around her. She's open about her struggles coming to terms with this new reality, with thinking, how is this happening in the year 2022? How is it happening to my city and my neighbors and to me? But also, why did I think we would be spared from war when there was already a war happening in our country since 2014? And then there are all these snatches of conversation she records on the street and in her cafe when it opens up again, and in grocery stores where she learns that cashiers are sleeping there because it's too dangerous for them to keep going back and forth between work and home, but they know that everyone needs food. Civilian life in wartime is such a muddled set of competing realities, and I'm glad that a book that represents that so well has had a real moment in multiple languages, because this was originally published in German in the newspaper Der Spiegel, and it's been translated into English by Greg Nissan and published by a small press. I'm going to read it again here at the beginning of this year, and in the spirit of acting and not just thinking, I've made another donation to Razom, a great organization that I link in all my videos in case you want to learn more about them and possibly donate to. This next one is an interesting case because it's a memoir by an author whose previous memoir I didn't love, so this is Return to Latvia by Marina Jarre. It's been translated from Italian by Ann Goldstein, who's best known as the translator for Elena Ferrante. And Jarre isn't considered a major author at home or abroad, at least from what I can tell. She died in 2016 at the age of 90, and she was only published in English in 2021 with her 1987 memoir, Distant Fathers. In the English edition, Distant Fathers opens with several different prefaces and introductions, and it all felt like maybe the publisher didn't trust readers to get it. I detected a sort of anxiety there. And to be honest, after reading Distant Fathers, I could see why they would be worried, because there are moments of real beauty, but it was also oddly muffled and at times barely legible, like almost opaque. So after I read that one, I gave it away. But I'd already bought Return to Latvia at the same time, and I wanted to give it a fair shot. So I picked it up randomly toward the end of this year, and wow, I just, everything that crossed over the line into the territory of not quite working with Distant Fathers swung back into the territory of, oh, this just works with Return to Latvia. All this author's strengths are in complete balance and harmony in this memoir, which is about the death of her father in the early days of the Holocaust, and about the personal rupture that occurred in all their lives before that. Because Jarre and her sister were raised in Latvia in their early childhood. Their mother was Italian Protestant and their father was Latvian Jewish. And when their parents split, they originally stayed in their father's country. But in 1935, when Jarre was 10, her mother arranged for them to be taken away in the night to Italy to live with her family. And Jarre never saw her father again before he was murdered. So in this book, she does three main things. She confronts this dynamic that she was estranged from her father before his death, and she goes through personal letters to do that. She also studies the specifics of the Latvian Holocaust with history books and archival materials that she requests, and she returns to Latvia 60 years after she left, this time with one of her grown sons. And it's also poetic and brutal and anesthetized too, because the Latvia of her childhood is one she experienced in German and Italian and Russian, and she goes back to a much more ethnically, religiously, and linguistically homogenous country. She doesn't feel a sense of ownership or entitlement toward anything, not the people or places of her past, because those things are gone. But she wants to face them instead of allowing her guilt to dictate how she relates to her own memories anymore. So yeah, this is an odd and intricate book, but not at all muffled. And I cried in the last few pages. I really felt some of what she was finally allowing herself to feel. As much as I love the other six, I mean, clearly these remaining four are in a category of their own, and three of them are about World War I. Actually, there's a mention of World War I in the other one too, but I think I will start with The Outlier, which is three novels by Karel Čapek, translated from Czech by M. and R. Weatherall. And in the past, I've recommended starting your reading of Čapek with his novel War with the Newts, and I stand by that. I think it's a better entry point, but these three novellas, because I would call them novellas, they're about 150 pages each, they're considered his masterpiece. He wrote them from 1933 to 34, and I'd read the first one before, but not the other two. The three novellas are unrelated except for thematically, and they're very different stylistically. But in his introduction, William Harkins does point out that they can be interpreted in the Hegelian way as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So the first, Hordubal, follows a man who's worked in the US for 8 years when his savings are stolen, and he returns to his wife and child in the Czech countryside only to find that they've moved on, even though he wants to become necessary to their lives again. It's such a sensitive rendering of an inner life, where his private monologues are intertwined with the natural world, with the landscape that still feels like his when nothing else does. And it transitions to an Agamemnon-style story, but with no Orestes and no Athena. Those are some breadcrumbs for all my Aeschylus fans out there. The second novel, Meteor, starts in a hospital on a night when a pilot crashes mid-flight and is burned beyond recognition. And while he's lying there with no discernible identity, three different people take it upon themselves to imagine the contours of his life. The third and longest section is from a poet who creates an entire backstory of this pilot's supposed life in Cuba. And it's so funny because it's Cuba as described by a poet who's clearly gifted with words, but has only ever read about this place and has never encountered a Black person, for example. Čapek is definitely riffing on how tedious this writer is, but I did ultimately become entangled in this ridiculous story. And Čapek isn't making a point that, oh, these three tales are completely at odds and aren't humans silly for trying to create meaning? Because actually, all three of the made-up accounts can be made to work together in a way. There's something intuitive about them, and it's a different kind of intuition and self-involvement for each author. The third novella is, oh my god, it's like so wonderful and so perfect. I think it's a perfect novella. It's called An Ordinary Life, and it's an old man in heart failure looking back on his mundane trajectory, on his childhood and studies and working on the railroads, getting married, and even just those parts are lovely in a way that's, it's hard to describe without sounding trite, but for a single small life to be detailed like this is a kind of gift, and Čapek really did believe that philosophically. And then this man starts to question himself and the way he's chosen to frame different moments in his life, and his need to make a cohesive portrait out of who he is, when even one choice by one person can be made with multiple motives. To be transparent, I read these novellas at a time when I was struggling to concentrate while I was reading, and I felt almost impatient at times with the first two because, and this will sound as dumb as it is, I had to concentrate to read them. I could tell how good they were, but they required even just a little more attention and a higher quality of attention than I had to give them some evenings, which was down to certain circumstances and also the fact that I hadn't taken any vacation time this whole past year. That's not as bad as it sounds. I had to save those days for certain things in the first half of this year, but I was patient and I did get into a rhythm with those first two, but the third one grabbed a hold of me, even when I wasn't at my best mentally. It made reading feel magical again. And forgive me a moment of bitterness when I say I'm convinced if Čapek had written in a major language, a book that's as good as An Ordinary Life would be widely circulated and assigned reading, and not something I had to find in a used bookstore with a Borders sticker on the back of it. So I think this might go against the recommendations of my fellow Czech literature specialists. We're a small but mighty crowd, because in my opinion, you should get your hands on this and read An Ordinary Life, even if you don't end up reading the other two. I promise you it's special. Okay, I have two novels and a nonfiction book left, and nonfiction is my number one, but the two novels have no order really, so I think I'll start with this one. This is Pat Barker's Regeneration, the first in her trilogy of novels about the First World War. I read the whole trilogy last year, and each one is a special book to me, but this first is my favorite, and it's a book I would recommend to almost anyone. It's phenomenal. My next video is going to be on all the World War I books I read in 2025, so I'll put this novel's quality in a little more context in that video, but essentially it has a mixture of historical and fictional characters, and we begin with a historical moment where the British poet Siegfried Sassoon, who'd been fighting in the trenches for years at that point, wrote a public letter in 1917 denouncing the war and protesting the deaths and sufferings of soldiers for causes he no longer believed to be righteous. To save him from being court-martialed for this letter, his good friend and fellow poet Robert Graves convinced Sassoon to claim he was out of his right mind when he wrote it. And because he's supposedly of unsound mind, he's sent to a hospital for mentally ill soldiers and put in the care of a doctor named William Rivers, which is how the book opens, with Sassoon arriving at Craig Lockhart War Hospital. As the story progresses, we meet a number of Rivers' patients and learn why each one is currently unfit for battle. And you come to trust Rivers. You trust that he's a very good doctor, which makes it all the more difficult to observe him in this context, because his job is to make these soldiers well enough to send back to the front. That's the goal of his treatment. That's why these patients' mental well-being is being prioritized by the medical system. And it's a job whose paradoxes Barker explores from a lot of angles. Like I said, there are many different characters and perspectives in here, and it has a real classic novel feeling to it. It's not at all difficult to read, but there's so much subtlety to the way she presents everything, to her framing of early 20th century medical and social perspectives on what we now call PTSD, and political perspectives on which viewpoints made you a functional part of this society and which ones put you beyond the pale. It's just a brilliant book. It's brilliantly conceived and executed. And of everything on this list, I think it is the one I would recommend to the most people I know. A book that's less traditional and much more of an immediate shock to the system is At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop, translated from French by Anna Moschovakis. And this is one of those I started with no expectations and that I then read in a day because I couldn't stop thinking about it. It feels like it steals into your senses. It's about Senegalese soldiers fighting for France in the trenches of World War I, and how one of those soldiers watches his best friend die without killing him and ending his misery. And that experience transforms his sense of morality and duty and justice. It's interesting to me that most often when this book is described, it's framed as this character's descent into madness. That's the common phrase, but I think it misses something important, because to descend into madness after a great trauma implies that you've snapped, you've abandoned rationality, you've lost your grip on reality. When what happens here, and what makes this book seductive, is that this character embraces the reality he finds himself in. Everything inside him shifts to accommodate it, and he repeats that he can now think for himself. He's freed himself from trying to reconcile the values he's been taught with the values of the war. He doesn't have to struggle with competing logics. He lives a new logic. And yeah, that is its own kind of madness, but doesn't it feel different to talk about it that way instead of saying trauma makes him go insane? These distinctions are at the heart of what it means to describe the psychological impact of World War I at all, in a way that's both more careful toward the individual and fundamentally less individualistic. Ali Smith's quote on the front calls this incantatory and visceral, which is the perfect way to put it. This has the rhythms and repetitions and hypnotic qualities of an incantation. In a year filled with books on this same topic, I truly didn't read anything else like it, so retroactively, I'm so pleased that it won the International Booker Prize in 2021, and it's making me think, should I read the International Booker shortlist this year? Should I give it another go and forget all the book prize lessons I've ever learned? I won't linger too much on my very top book because it's the one I've discussed most extensively on the channel. This is the historian Margaret MacMillan's Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World, and that subtitle is an understatement. In so many ways, this is the modern world we live in, and the foundation of our geopolitics is what was prioritized in the wake of World War I. The book mostly follows the leaders of France, Britain, and the US, Georges Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Woodrow Wilson, as they led the Paris peace talks and drew up the treaties, restructuring the map of the world, creating the first transnational League of Nations, and attempting to honor the vague principle of national self-determination in some cases while disregarding it in others. This is 500 pages and it has a tall trim size and small font, so I'm not discounting the investment here. This wouldn't be something most people could read in a week or two, including me, but it could be so much longer for what it is and for how much ground it covers. I would categorize Paris 1919 as a very reader-friendly history project, and actually ever since it was published in 2001, it's been popular with book clubs because these negotiations were so dramatic and gripping, and MacMillan makes a large amount of information feel pretty digestible. So I'll link the timestamp below for my longer review on this, but overall, it's a tremendous book, and it's for people who read a lot of nonfiction and for people who don't. Thank you for watching. I couldn't be more grateful that there are people who want to hear me talk about these books I so desperately need to talk about. So thank you again, and I'll see you soon for another video.